Johnny Wood's going to start off talking about what they're doing with their meat goat enterprise.
First thing we're going to get into is a quick photo. I wanted to, I guess, show everybody that what I've found with meat goat production is goats tend to operate kind of by their own rules. And I thought 2 goats on the hood and 1 on the seat of an 8-in Ford might be a good way to kind of show everybody that as we get started. Just a quick overview of where we're going to go. Going to look at mainly why you're getting into goats, what are the reasons for it, the biggest challenges that I've faced with meat goat production. I'm going to touch on weaning and kidding and guardian dogs, and touch on marketing at the end. So why goats? Obviously, the multi-species advantage is what we're all here to talk about today. And goats are a browser. So if you mix goats with cattle, obviously cattle are a grazer, goats are a browser. So your woody plants, all your weeds, multiflora rows, any invasive species is going to be the first thing that the goat is going to go for. So they're very non-competitive grazers with beef cattle. So it works well in that regard. Land clearing is another aspect of it. And I talked to a few folks yesterday that know of this, and there's one business in southern Iowa that's doing this. So they'll bring in a semi-load of goats and use electric netting and move the goats around on a daily basis to do brush control. And one aspect, actually there's 2 things in this picture. One, this goat is being attacked by the dog for stealing its food. Secondly, there's about 100 goats in this picture, and in a brush situation, that could clear an acre of extremely dense brush in 2 days or less. So you're constantly moving the netting, so there's quite a bit of labor involved, and that would be one aspect to definitely keep in mind. And then for the young producers, where I came in, so at the time when I got into goats, you could buy bred heifers for $3,000 a head and a bred nanny for $300. And you could stock them at double the rate or more of cows, and you needed essentially no equipment. A truck and a trailer and a work ethic goes a long ways with goats. So that's why I kind of went in with the small ruminant mindset. So the next slide, I kind of ranked this in kind of Olympic style. Gold, silver, and bronze are the 3 biggest challenges that I've faced. First off is parasites, and they're going to take the gold. The 2 things you're going to fight most are barber pole worm, which will lead to anemia, and these, let me go back, pointer here. So these 3 slides, so you'll peel the eyelid back and look at eyelid color. This is cherry red, and this is what you want to see. This is a healthy animal, and really at this point, no action is required. I mean, this is a healthy animal. This middle slide is pink. At this point, you're going to want to pay close attention to the animals in this set. Might consider deworming at some point. Obviously, keep a close watch. When you get over here, you can't see it as much, but this is white. And the main tool you're going to want at this point is probably just a shovel to dig a hole to throw all the deads in, because they're anemic. And what I've found is 30% death loss is very common if you have goats that get to this stage. So there's the dark side. What do you do about it? I started out using conventional dewormers. Most of those don't work. The only one that does work would be this guy here, Prohibit. I'll use that for 3 days in a row to deworm. But the main thing is down here. I went with more of a holistic approach to worm control, which ties into the next slide of, is it a worm problem or a farm problem? Most of the time, if your goats are wormy, it's not so much the worm's fault, it's a management issue. You've overgrazed and you've set an environment where the goats are grazing too low to the ground. The majority of your parasites are in the bottom 2 inches of the grass. So if you're overgrazing, you're going to create a worm problem. So rotation is key. Apple cider vinegar, I mix raw vinegar with water, keep that out free choice. I'll use diatomaceous earth or DE there, mix that with pellets. That way you know they're ingesting it. I don't really keep that out free choice. I mainly will mix that with a pellet and make sure the animal gets it. And high copper mineral. When I first started, my mineral was about 1,000 parts per million, and now it's 5,000. And I've had a drastic reduction in parasite issues. Obviously that issue is always going to be there still, but with a more management approach and the vinegar, the DE, and the high copper mineral, that's really helped slow down the worm issue. And finally, if you do have an animal that's constantly wormy, the best thing to do is just get that genetic pool out of the herd and cull the animal. The second thing that's going to take the silver medal is foot care. Now, obviously, goats are what I call a dry land critter. Our region in northern Missouri is 40 to 45 inch average rainfall. With that in mind, goats don't like that. They're not used to a wet environment. That's not where they originated from. And you'll fight two main things, foot rot and scald. And this right here is it's a wet, hot abscess, not only an abscess, but more of an open sore. And every step they take when they get this just irritates it. And it'll get to the point where they'll crawl on their knees and they can't get to water, and the body condition obviously begins to drop off rapidly. So the main thing to address this is trim the hoof, clean it out very well, and then I soak it in copper tox, which will dry out that sore. And again, if you have an animal that's constantly having foot care problems, that's where I'll essentially just cull the animal and remove it. If it can't, the way I see it, if it can't raise itself in the pasture without much intervention, then I don't need it in the herd. This is a little bit graphic, but I had a good vet friend of mine, we're good friends now, but he moved to the area the same time I got started, and he felt so sorry for me with goats that were dying. He taught me how to do my own necropsies. So I would just take pictures and send it to him. And obviously in this slide here, this is pneumonia, which would be another issue you're going to fight. You've got lesions in the lungs. This lung color is entirely too dark, and this is, you can't tell by the photo obviously, but the lung is very hard. And the main thing that will trigger pneumonia is in kid goats in the spring and the fall, where you have 40 degrees in the morning and in the afternoon it's 80. They simply can't adjust. And I actually use a vaccine. I only use 2 vaccines for the whole program, one of which is more for respiratory protection. In the treatment, there's 2 options to go. I don't use much for antibiotic. One thing I would use is Exceed for that. There's also another drug called Salix, where it'll basically pull the fluid out of the animal, but at the same time you need to give it electrolytes to rehydrate it. And pneumonia is something I don't fight nearly as much. It would be definitely something to watch. And there's 2 different types of pneumonia. So you have a very rapid onset pneumonia where the animal's healthy at 7 in the morning and at 7 at night, the animal's dead. You also have slower types of pneumonia where you have more time to react and address the issue. And again, kind of touching on processing. As far as processing, I don't do much. I give a CD&T shot, which is essentially just tetanus, and then the pre-sponse again for the pneumonia. That's really the only 2 things I do anymore. I'll give the first round 2 weeks prior to weaning, and then put the kids right back on their moms, and that seems to really minimize the stress load they're under. And then I'll also band my buck kids at that time, come back 2 weeks later at weaning, and give that second round of shots. And I used to treat the entire herd. I'd get them in and give everything. I'd trim all their hooves, I'd deworm, give shots, and that was basically creating an animal that needed that every year. So I got away from hoof trimming unless they needed it, and got away from deworming unless they need it. So I'll only worm an animal that's wormy. And that's considerably solved some management problems that were driving me crazy. So strictly on an as-needed basis for veterinary side of things, and culling. That's the best way to get a more resilient herd. Enough of the gory stuff and the death. We're going to move into kidding. The main thing with kidding is what time of the season are you going to kid? If you kid in the winter, which is what I was doing initially, you're going to have a considerable amount of labor. You need barns, and goats don't always go in barns. So cold rains are probably one of the most costly things you're going to fight if you're kidding in the winter time. For example, I'm moving to a late April, early May kidding window. Reason being, I did a trial this past year where I kidded in February. Out of 175 kids, I killed 35 on 2 bad rain events. I kidded in May, just a small group, 25 kids, and lost 1. Reason being, when it rains in February, it's cold, and when it rains in May, it's warm. Major difference and far less labor. I was checking 1 time a day in May, and in February, I might check 4 to 5 times. So it gets back into that more, kidding with nature, so to speak. I mean, you're kidding when they're designed to kid, and minimal intervention. The other aspect that's just as important as when you kid is nutrition. And I got an email address here to jot down. This is a program through Iowa State called Brands. And essentially you can put in all your feed values that you're feeding, hay, whatever you have, plug it into the program for dry does, lactating does, gestating does, lactating, late lactation, and you can find your energy requirements. And what I didn't know initially was I was figuring a goat would have similar requirements as a cow. So I was feeding them approximately 3% of their body weight when they really needed 6%. So I essentially was unknowingly starving the animal, and you get into poor nutrition and no milk. And when you do that, you'll get really good at filling these up and bottle feeding kids 3 and 4 times a day and then questioning why you're in the goat business. So definitely timing and nutrition is very key. Another thing you don't want to do is put young dogs, less than a year old, in with goat kids. Problem is, dogs like the afterbirth. So they'll eat the afterbirth off the ground, and then there's still some on the goat kids, so they'll get that, and then they'll just eat the goat. And so fairly counterproductive when your dogs are eating your crop. So, and traumatic for all parties involved. So something to avoid. So we survived kidding. Going to touch on weaning. As you can see, this is what you want: the dog watching the goat, not eating it. So my buck kids, I'll wean off at 90 days of age. The doe kids, I'll wean at 120. I like to leave my doe kids on as long as possible. And fence line weaning versus dry lot, I've done both ways. If you fence line wean and don't have good fencing, expect calls from family and neighbors to tell you your goats are on the highway or their porch or other places. Woven wire fencing is critical for fence line weaning. Electric, they want mom, and they will go through anything regardless of how hot your fence is. So definitely something, if you're going to fence line wean, keep a good tight fence. And then post weaning, I'll basically, on fence line, I'll leave them kind of across the fence for about 10 days and then separate my does and bucks off. Does go to a pasture timber mix, and my buck kids, I'm somewhat limited on acreage, so my buck kids are actually supplemented and in a smaller paddock, and they're being supplemented. Actually, getting down to grazing goats, this was a before and after shot. So that the picture on the left was 2 days before the picture on the right. Everything from the ground to 6 feet high will be completely demolished. Poison ivy, multiflora rosebush, all the noxious weeds is like candy to a goat. So they are going to go for that very quickly. And in this situation, this was ground that hadn't been grazed in about 25 years. So there was a prime goat habitat. Fencing, again, in corrals. The corral's pretty basic. Even cattle panels and T-posts are enough. You just need an area where you can gather the goats to move or catch dogs or treat an animal. So pretty basic to set up a corral, but you definitely want to have one. Fencing on your chargers, anything less than 6 joules or 3,000 volts, the goats will walk through it while laughing at you. So that's kind of a minimum that I go by. Solar chargers I haven't had much luck with because they just don't have the joules. They've got the bark, but they've got no bite. And so I use 110 everywhere that I can. Water, not an issue. A full-grown nanny will drink a 1/4 gallon of water a day, if that. So I've never turned down a land opportunity for the fact that there's no water. I mean, you can haul a 250-gallon water shuttle will go a long ways for even a herd of 100 goats. So not an issue there. And again, rotation for minimizing your parasites. When a goat, if it is wormy and it's shedding parasites, they're alive in the grass for about 21 days. So as long as you're rotating in a system where you're going to want it to rest more than 21 days anyways, but as long as you're giving that 21-day rest cycle, you're coming back to a clean pasture and not reinfesting the goats with parasites. And then again, acre requirements. I figure about 2.5 pairs to an acre. And in our country, you know, you're figuring with cows, depending upon your grazing setup, 1.5 acres to 2 acres for one cow and calf, and you're talking one calf, and in this model, 2.5 pairs, you should be getting 5 to 6 kids. So certainly a higher stocking rate on the goat side. The dogs, when I first got into goats, I got into guard donkeys, thought that was the answer, and it turned out not to be at all. Went to a guy's place and he had 2 donkeys, and the first problem was their names were Ruby and Vito. And I should have known right then this was not a good sign. And secondly, I bonded them with the goats for about 3 or 4 days, turned them out into a pasture. The goats went north, and these are 2 male donkeys, mind you. They went west, and as the sun went down, I could see them mounting on the horizon, and that night I lost 12 kids to coyotes. So the donkeys found the new home the next day and got into guardian dogs. And from what I've found, the dogs will eat about 2 pounds of feed a day, cost about 50 cents a pound, so $1 a day is your insurance program. And the most expensive dogs that I've bought, price-wise, I bought $200 dogs, I bought $1,000 dogs. The $1,000 dogs are the cheapest dogs you'll buy, and the $200 dogs are the most expensive. From my experience, you get what you pay for, and if you find someone that's selling an old 3 or 4-year-old dog for $200, it's not a deal. Another thing to note is young dogs and old goats and vice versa. Mixing young dogs with young goats will be another traumatic experience, as you will find that your goat kids have all the hair missing off the bottom of their legs from the dogs chewing on them. So in that situation, you'll definitely want to get the dogs out and put those older dogs with older goats, or young dogs with older goats. And eventually, I've had some of my best dogs now chewed on goat kids at a young age, and now they're my best dog. So they can come out of it, but you've got to remedy the situation when there's problems. And my feeders, these dimensions here are actually pretty important. I've tried multiple ways to keep the goats out of the dog food. A goat, if it gets in there, can eat 50 pounds of dog food like it's its job. And at $28 a bag, and they get that a few times, that's less than ideal. So this dimension here, so this is 24 inches up, the opening. From the ground to the bottom of the opening is 24 high, 20 wide, and 10.5 inches. The opening itself is 10.5 inches tall. And the dog will actually go through on its side, and a goat won't. And I've tried different size openings that the goats figured out before the dogs did. I've tried warehouse flaps where the dogs push through. The goats figured it out before the dogs. I've tried 50-gallon barrels with flaps that the dogs push through, and the goats figure it out first. And in some cases, the dog will wait until the goat comes out to go in and eat. So pretty impressive what a goat will do to get dog food. So this system right here is definitely what I've found to be best. The problem with feeding dogs outside of this is they like to eat. They're constantly running, constantly working. They like to eat multiple times a day. So if they need 2 pounds, you'll feed them, they'll eat a couple bites, and these goats in the background will come up and eat all of it. And then your dog's hungry, which gets back to my point of physical attacks. So definitely having a self-feeder is best for what I've done. Touching on the marketing side, the pricing at the top here is actually 2 different prices that I got into. This had been last fall. Selling live through the auction barns can be very effective for getting a good price if you time it on the seasonality. This was 3 weeks apart. I sold a set of goats, 65 pounds at $2.80 a pound for $182 a head. 3 weeks later, the exact same set of goats in the same pasture brought $2 a pound. So an 80-cent swing in 3 weeks. $52 a head difference. So on the flip side here, on direct marketing, got my butcher costs, processing, you're looking at about $207 after you take care of your butchering costs. Compare that to live, and if you've timed your live just right, you're only making $25 a head more after you've done the work to get it in the package and get it sold. If you time live wrong, like I did, you can make $77 a head more. And the main issue with a goat is you're talking about a 30-pound carcass. I mean, a 60, 65-pound goat will dress 30 to 31 pounds. So it's a very small carcass. So your butchering costs like I say, with the marketing, you need at least $10 a pound to make it make sense to go direct. And I'm working with, there's a restaurant close to our area that's sourcing all local foods. And I'm actually going to be getting him his first goat in about 2 weeks. And there's a college about 10 miles from the farm with a very high population of kids from a couple of different countries, India being one, that's looking for local goat meat. So there are opportunities out there on both sides. So the marketing aspect has a couple angles to go. Just a quick list here of suppliers. So my netting, you can get netting from various sources. Premier One Supplies, they're in Washington, Iowa. They have the best netting. It's got double staked. It doesn't, the single stakes are prone to fall over. It's double staked and it's hardy, it's tough stuff. You really have to get pretty aggressive to rip the netting. I get my mineral and vinegar. This would be Nature's Best, Will Winters, the sales rep for that. That's where I get the high copper mineral and the vinegar. Kinco Farm Fencing, they have a couple locations. One's in Missouri, one's in Pennsylvania. Great way to get fencing shipped direct to your door. It's good stuff. Everything I buy, besides the netting, is through Kinco, and it's a great way to get good quality product. This is another guy, this fencing supplier in central Missouri. That's the cheapest fiberglass posts that I've ever found. It's about $3.50 for a 6-foot post. Most of what I'm doing is 3 strands of electric for a perimeter and using fiberglass. It lasts for eternity and super cheap. And hay comes out of central Illinois, fine stem, no mold. And goats are extremely picky on hay. Anything else they'll eat. The worst things imaginable. I mean, filling up on poison ivy and poison sumac doesn't sound appealing, but to a goat, they'll fill up on that first. But when it comes to hay, they're the exact opposite. So fine stem hay, no mold, is critical. They will abort if you feed them moldy hay. So they just can't handle mold like a cow would. So that's, certainly I've found that out the hard way. And then feeding veterinary, of course, on a local basis. And I want to finish up with one thought, quote from Winston Churchill: "Success is the ability to go from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm." And in this photo, this would be grazing cattle with goats. And you generally wouldn't think of a water tank as a death trap until you've got goats. So the kid goats will jump up on the ring and run around, and then they'll fall in and swim to the point of exhaustion and drown. So I had to make cinder block stairwells in each tank to let the goats, regardless of which way they swim, they'll hit the blocks and climb out. And I can list 10 more ways that goats will perish, and we'll save the time. But the main thing is with goats and livestock in general, the worst thing you can do on something like that is quit. You just have to persevere through it. I mean, goats are going to show you ways to do things you never thought imaginable. But given time, you'll build a goat herd. Thank you.